Well, good morning. We're going to run today the plenary session on the status and trends of global seafood trade. I have Audun from FAO on my right and Xavier Guillot from EUMOFA on my left. I was requested to give some kind of presentation, but I only will drop a few words and some thoughts. And the first thought that it is crystal clear in my mind, that it should be crystal clear in all people involved in economics in these industries, that the seafood industry is a business rather than a charity. And if we don't have this clear, I have to tell that our competitors have it clear. And it's one idea I got when I work especially in Southeast Asia and Latin America. They know they need to make a profit. Of course, environmental and social sustainability is a critical issue, and we can say it's the starting point without we cannot survive as an industry. But there is also economic sustainability, and the key requirement for economic sustainability is making a profit. It's the difference of being alive or being dead. So if we want to make a profit as producers, we totally depend on the market. If we don't have a market, if we don't succeed on the market, then we will not get any kind of income. We will incur in losses. And finally, we will have to close. And sometimes it's better to close with the minimum losses than close with enormous debts, being unable to recover in the rest of our life. Well, getting information from the market is not so easy. And right now, we are in lack of information from many countries. There are countries in the European Union who have been producing statistics. Probably it's a cultural or historic push for these countries. And there are other countries where it is almost impossible to arrive to information even at the wholesale level, not say in the retail level. But if anyone has ever been collecting information from the markets, might realize of the hard work which is needed. Many times when we release results, the first thing that is criticized is the sources of data. Okay, we might be wrong or we might be not so far from reality if we talk about absolute terms, but most of the papers that have been published and reports indicates that at least the trends and the evolution of the markets fits quite well with what is been happening and what is happening right now. So there is a hard work behind these tools for collecting and providing works, and as they are the stars this morning, I'm not going to talk anymore. Just want to acknowledge the hard work of these two guys and their teams, and please clap hard your hands. Our first speaker will be Audun from FAO Globfish.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's always a dilemma when people start clapping before you start. Thank you for those words, Pepe. And I will not dwell too much on numbers this time. I will not give you too many numbers in the absolute. I will more focus on trends. I will focus on trends because I think that is more important than the absolute numbers year by year, which of course change year by year. I'm not avoiding the numbers because we don't think they are precise or correct, but I think we have to focus on the trends. It's the trends that are more important. So, 2015 is a year of anniversaries and commemoration. So I congratulate, of course, EAFE with its anniversary. But you're not alone this year. You know, of course, that the English and many others are celebrating the 800 years of Magna Carta. I'm sure all of you know that, but maybe not all of you know that Magna Carta also includes several paragraphs on fisheries rights and access to fishing. So it shows that also in history, the access to markets and to fishing and the rights, tenure, has been important for centuries. In FAO, we're also celebrating our 70-year anniversary this year, and we're also celebrating the 20 years of the Code of Conduct of Sustainable Fisheries, and I'll come back to that later. I will not talk too much about the FAO, but I think this body knows who we are and what we do. So I'll start by giving an overview of what I'll talk about. I'll talk about trade, but before I talk about trade, I'll talk about the supply situation, what is produced and where it's being produced. I'll talk about some issues related to markets, related to development in international trade and markets, talk about consumers, consumptions, prices, etc. And in the end, some emerging issues including traceability and certification. 20 years ago, 185 countries managed to get agreement on the adoption of the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. Despite the name, it's not only about capture fisheries, it's in fact also including aquaculture. But in FAO, when we say fisheries, we tend to think that it's all-inclusive. But I'd like to highlight that it's just as important for aquaculture and aquaculture development and for trade as it is for capture fisheries. And this Code of Conduct that was adopted 20 years ago is not just a standalone document. It has generated a number of guidelines, international instruments, which then have become international law to some extent, and very often national law. So this is important to remember. The Code of Conduct is a voluntary guide, but it results in a number of guidelines and instruments, and which are translated very often into national legislation. And in this way, many of the requirements and principles and suggestions, recommendations of the Code of Conduct, in fact, becomes national law. So, these are the figures that we have for the most recent snapshot of international supply, 2012. As I said, I will not mention any of the numbers. What is important here to see is how incredibly global the supply situation is. You see immediately the importance of Asia, Southeast Asia, which is mostly aquaculture, but you see the big share here on the right, which is mostly China, but also the Sea of Okhotsk, so Pacific Russia. You see India, you see the Indian Ocean, you see South America, North America, and Northern Europe in particular. So really we're talking about a global supply situation. And if you look at the different colors, these are representing the different species, but we will not go into the different breakdowns. And it's all on the internet in any case. So coming back to what you said about data, we do have data for this. The data in FAO are reported to FAO by FAO member countries. They may be not 100% correct every year, and I'm sure they are not, but the trends are what we are focusing on. It's the trends that are important. So this is the situation in the aggregate. The overall supply situation is about, as you can see, 160-70 million tons a year. You know, all of you know that capture fisheries are stable around 90, 91, 92 million tons. So it's the aquaculture, of course, sector which is driving not only supply over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but also, as we think, together with the OECD over the next 10 years. If you look at the most recent figures, it's business as usual. Stable capture fisheries in the aggregate despite El Nino, and aquaculture continuing to grow. The growth of aquaculture, of course, is important to all of us, but it's important for many different reasons. For economists, it's important because markets are expanded. It interacts with the capture sector. For other people, it's important because of consumer issues, retailers, logistics, product development, etc. But for us in FAO, aquaculture is also important because of its contribution to fish as food. And if we are to stabilize or even increase consumption in the world of fish and fishery products, of course, we have to rely on a growing aquaculture sector to take up that slack that will come because of growing population and growing demand for fish. So fish is important not just in its contribution to overall food security, it's also important because of its very specific nutritional aspects. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. The situation of capture fisheries today is well known to all of us. You may see here that I'm not using the word exploitation. I don't think exploitation is a good word, so I've substituted it for utilized, and we are trying to do that in FAO now. And it's not, of course, terminology is not the substance of my presentation, but as we said also in some of the presentations earlier on, terminology is important because the words we use really communicate what we are trying to say. And if we use the wrong words, we are really not giving the right message, or the message that we want to convey is not received as we would like it to be received. So if you exploit labor and if you exploit slaves, why should you exploit fish and think that's good? So I'm using the word utilized and fished or harvested. In any case, the situation is, as you know, stable marine fisheries, some potential in inland fisheries, so it's the aquaculture sector which is growing. This one is showing the share of the share of export or trade in overall production, overall supply. And I'm showing it because it's a bit strange. We're talking about globalization, we're talking about growing supply, we're talking about growing exports and growing imports, and all this is true. But at the same time, you see that in this sense, we are becoming a little bit less globalized because the share of trade is in fact going down a little bit. But when you come to think of it, what could the reasons be for this? And I think the reason is that you have growing aquaculture production which is less and less export oriented, and it means that more and more of aquaculture growth, whether it's in Africa or Asia or South and Central America, is not export oriented as it used to be. It's in response to domestic consumption. So more and more of the growth we see in the world of aquaculture production will in fact go to domestic consumption. And that of course is very important also from a food security perspective. So fish trade remains growing, it is important, but the absolute share in overall production has been going down over the last few years. But this of course could grow in the future again. So here you see how trade overall has been growing very quickly. At the same time, of course, per capita consumption of fish and fishery products has grown quite rapidly, and in 2014 reached for the first time the level of 20 kilos. 20 kilos per capita on the average in the world, and that of course is a very important milestone for the sector, and it shows the importance of fish and fishery products also to overall food security and consumption. And this is something that we think also will continue to grow in the future, but maybe a little bit less than it has historically. The globalization of seafood, there are a number of reasons for it. I mentioned two of them. Growing population, of course. There's a growing demand in terms of consumption shift towards fish and fishery products. A lot of countries, as soon as they become more wealthy, they create an internal demand for more healthy products, or what they perceive as being healthy, and that of course includes fish and fishery products. There's also the role of outsourcing and processing in third countries, and this in itself also adds to global trade flows. In FAO, together with University of Stavanger and also others, on prices, and we've managed to see that even in where there is less trade and less imports and less exports than in others, still these markets remain exposed to international flows, international trends in prices and consumption. And this of course is interesting. So even, as I mentioned, that maybe the overall share of trade in the supply has stabilized, it still remains incredibly important, the flows and the trends and the changes in behavior overall in local markets, even when trade is limited in those markets themselves. Here you can see on your left how imports have been growing. We know, of course, that imports are growing, have been growing overall more in the developed countries traditionally because they have more money, of course. But we see that the strongest growth in the last 5, 6, 7 years has in fact been in developing countries. So imports by developing countries now is growing much faster than in developed countries, and not just because of the crisis that we've seen since 2008, 2009. But still the share represented by developed countries in imports continue to be much more important, of course, than those of developing countries. That's for import. But when you look at the export figure, it's quite different, and it's more or less a 50, or it used to be more or less 50-50%. 50% of export coming from developed countries and 50% from developing countries. Although over the last 4 or 5 years, the developing country exports have overtaken quite significantly those of developed countries. I mentioned that overall average consumption in the world now of fish and fishery products reached for the first time 20 kilos, mostly thanks to aquaculture. And what is important here is that, in fact, the share of aquaculture overtook that of capture fisheries for the first time in 2014. So out of those, on average, 20 kilos, now more than half, more than 10 kilos come from aquaculture and a little bit less than 10 kilos from capture fisheries. So this is a significant breakthrough, not only of the aquaculture sector, but this is a trend that will also change more and more the logistical picture and the picture of trade development, maybe price flows, price drivers in the future. Because if you think in 10, 15 years from now, maybe aquaculture sector will contribute 70, 75%, at least 70% of what we as humans consume as fish and fishery products. And that of course means that we will increasingly have to rely on aquaculture products for our daily needs of fish and fishery products, with challenges and opportunities both for the aquaculture sector and for the capture fisheries, of course. This is by species. I will not make any detailed comments. Of course, the species groups that have been growing more quickly, of course, are those you can find in aquaculture, especially freshwater species, tilapia, catfish, etc. Salmon to some extent, but not that much. It's really now tilapia which really has taken over as the main driver within freshwater aquaculture. World fish trade increasing year by year, new record in 2014. I was asked to make some estimates for 2015, and I was a little bit optimistic, I think, when I said that maybe in 2015 we'll reach for the first time $150 billion in terms of exports. But the numbers, at least in the first quarter, look a little bit more modest. Volumes in international trade are still increasing in 2015, but because of the strong dollar, many of the export figures from many countries, when denominated in dollars, are in fact going down. So even if exports in many exporting countries in the local currency are going up, when you nominate it in dollars, they're going down. So we'll still have to see how much the growth in exports will be in 2015. But the trend in terms of volume are positive, and there's a slight increase also in values when denominated in dollars. But in any case, the trend is positive. We had a small fall in 2008 or 9 related to the crisis, but the overall trend in international fish exports is clearly positive. Who are the biggest importers and exporters? Well, the EU, of course, 28 countries now dominate, and this is only the external trade of the EU which is included. There's no internal trade here. The US has firmly overtaken Japan. China, of course, is importing more and more fish. China is importing not only for processing and re-exports, but also for its domestic consumption to some extent of species they don't have. Korea is an important player. Russia has been and still is, despite some difficulties and boycotts. And there are many other countries as well on the import side. Of course, I think almost all countries that appear as countries in the overall statistics also have some imports of fish. So it really is global. The exporters, China again, as the biggest producer. It's no surprise that China is a major and biggest and dominating exporter. Norway is big. Norway is big not only because there is a lot of fish in Norway and salmon, but there are only 5 regions, so you can only eat so much. Vietnam has grown up. It's a large importer and has become a very large exporter. And this is also very, very important. It's a significant rise in the exports from Vietnam. Thailand, the traditional largest exporter. Thailand used to be the biggest exporter in the world, bigger than China, bigger than Norway for many years. But Thailand is now falling to some extent, both because of domestic problems related to shrimp, and probably will see a stagnating processing sector for all sorts of reasons over the next 2-3 years as well. The US remain important, the EU as well. India and Chile are growing quite quickly because of aquaculture. In FAO, I mentioned that together with the OECD, we made a number of projections. These are the overall projections for food consumption or fish consumption. They're both positive, and again, you can see that the consumption in developed countries, we foresee some stagnation or a very slow growth, but the growth per capita in the world, so per capita, is foreseen to come from different countries. And this, of course, goes with what I said earlier because of growing income, growing needs for fish and fishery products. We also made a number of scenarios, and these are just the aggregate ones, growing trends both in trade, exports, imports, etc. I've not mentioned any of the scenarios here. We also generated a number of scenarios, optimistic, pessimistic scenarios, and in some of the optimistic scenarios, in fact, the growth in production and trade and consumption is much higher than in the others. And of course, this will also drive prices down because of lower cost, which reinforces consumption, etc., etc. But this is something we could maybe come back to in the 30-year anniversary or something when we have more of these projections also. I mentioned prices. Together with the University of Stavanger and others, FAO has developed a fish price index, and here you can see the fish price or the prices of fish as shown in the blue graph related to meat. As Pepe said and others said also this morning, we have to always remember that fish is not a standalone product. There's competition out there, not only between different fish species, but also between fish and other types of food, other types of protein. And of course, this also means that the prices, the relative prices, are also important. And here we've put meat, but we could also put, we could also have a breakdown on poultry and other types of products. The FAO price index is something we started with maybe now 5-6 years ago. We are developing further uses for it. We have sub-indices. You can break it down into aquaculture and capture fisheries. You can do it by species. You can do it by regions. And we have a large technical paper that describes this fish price index. Probably will be published next month. It's now with the editors and the printers. So next month or in June at the latest, there will be a new large FAO paper, technical paper on the fish price index and what's behind it and how you can go through the parameters and see how we have developed it. I mentioned this initially. Again, it's very important for us in FAO, but also like to mention at least other issues. The issue of traceability. Traceability in the supply chain is important for many reasons, and it's a regulatory requirement in many importing countries, including the EU, US, Japan, and others. But the different purposes and reasons for having traceability have changed a little bit. Traceability is now being more and more also used to be able to document that the fish that you're selling has a legal origin. This is now a requirement in the US and the EU, of course. And in FAO, we are also developing new guidelines for catch documentation schemes, which also are closely related to traceability. So that is traceability related to the legality of supply, the legality of production of the fish. But there's also traceability related to food safety, which is maybe what we have traditionally thought most about. There is the issue of certification. Certification has become a very large issue, not only for capture fisheries, but also for aquaculture products. And for many exports to developed countries in particular, if you are not certified, your product will simply not be bought by many buyers. So very often, therefore, you have no choice. The choice you have is between which label or which scheme you want to use. The problem is that if you export to 10 or 20 different countries or markets, maybe the markets have different requirements and will ask you to have 5 or 10 different labels. So this is the situation, and this is not up to date. There are many more labels as well. So this has increased the cost for producers and processors, not only in developing countries, but also developed countries. So FAO has tried to do some work on this. We've developed guidelines to eco-labels for capture fisheries, both inland and marine, and for aquaculture, providing advice what should be as a minimum in the schemes of the different eco-labels. FAO is also participating in the GSSI initiative, the Global Seafood Sustainability Initiative, which tries to harmonize a little bit and benchmark the different schemes that are out there in the market compared to the Code of Conduct and the various FAO instruments. So hopefully that will simplify the situation in the future. But we'll have to see. The benchmarking tool of the GSSI is just being piloted right now. I'll also mention the issue of CITES, or the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species, which traditionally was not so important for our sector, but now because of the listing a couple of years ago of certain shark species, for the first time there are now species on the CITES list that are of commercial importance. So that also shows the importance of environmental issues within the CITES context to international trade in fish and fishery products. I mentioned initially that eating fish is good for you, and it's good for you for all sorts of reasons that I'm sure and hope that this audience is totally convinced of, so I will not go into detail. But in particular, it's important in the developing world. In the developed countries, we have a number of alternative resources of food. Very often in developing countries, they don't. Very often in developing countries, even though the overall, on average, consumption of fish is much lower, so is the overall protein consumption. So it means that it's even more important for them in their contribution to the daily needs of nutrients and food. So to conclude again, the celebration, and it's not just to celebrate, it shows the importance of the Code of Conduct and the instruments linked to that. And in Vigo in Spain in October, the FAO will have a very large conference related to the Code of Conduct, what we have done, what remains to be done, what are the challenges ahead. And there will be a very large conference for governments, stakeholders, industry, policymakers during the first or second week of October. It's the 8th or 9th of October. So I hope to see some of you or many of you there. There's also a number of issues of importance for economists. So supply is increasing thanks to aquaculture. Fisheries management and capture fisheries in particular remain a very important and crucial issue. World trade is increasing as is supply, thanks to globalization. The share of the 3 big markets, Japan, US, EU, still dominates, but it's declining because it's the emerging markets that are increasing the fastest. And of course the role of China here is crucial. The role of China as a producer is crucial, not only to the well-being of Chinese consumers, but in fact also as a supplier to world markets. And yeah, I didn't mention the role of the fish trade subcommittee in FAO, but we have a body within the FAO that discusses all these issues, that meets every 2 years, and will meet also early next year possibly in Morocco. So I mentioned some issues that are very much on the agenda and that will be very important in terms of determining market access for fish and fishery products. I mentioned traceability, eco-labeling and certification, and to some extent also CITES. So thank you very much for your attention.